Our speaker today is Dr. Benjamin Bergen. He is a professor of cognitive science at the University of California in San Diego. So he's come a long way virtually to be with us today. He directs the Language and Cognition Lab. He studies language and cognition in the laboratory and in the wild. He's the author of 2 books, Louder Than Words, and his recent book is What the F, of which I have a copy. I've read the first 100 pages, and it's every bit as interesting as the reviews said it would be. He has a great sense of humor. It's an examination of how and why we swear and what profanity reveals about our minds, our brains, and ourselves. I'm not going to, out of respect for Jim Peterson, not going to make any puns about cunning linguists. Right now to Dr. Bergen, it's all yours, sir. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to talk to you all. I just want to make sure, is my audio and video okay here? Can you see and hear me just fine? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So I'd like to share my screen if I could. You can see some slides.
Yes, you have permission to do that.
Thank you very much. And I think that this should show a screen. Has that successfully shown a screen? Oh, hold on. No, that's going to be the wrong thing. So this is always the thing, right? With
you have to go full screen.
Yeah, here, I'm going to try this again. This is, you would think that a year into a pandemic doing remote teaching, I would have figured this out, but as it happens, I have not.
That's okay.
All right, let's try this again. Okay. Let's see if I can share this once again. How about that? Does that look like a full screen?
Yes, it does.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so as Joe said, my work focuses on language and the brain, language and how, what it reveals about human evolution, about how humans have developed the cognitive capacities that they have. And some of my work recently has focused on this particular niche in language that is understudied because it's taboo, but may reveal things that we wouldn't otherwise know. That's what I'd like to do with our time today. I want to spend a little bit of time just sort of fleshing out what we know about profanity from the science of swearing. And then I want to focus on the things that we've learned about language and the brain, about the evolution of the human species, that we wouldn't have known if we hadn't dared to investigate profanity. So the unique things that it reveals. So profanity is different from the rest of language. It's unique in a bunch of ways, including the physiological reactions that it provokes in people who use it, either who produce it or who hear it or read it. When you're swearing, regardless of your gender identity, all of a sudden your heart rate starts racing, your blood pressure increases, adrenaline is released, your pupils dilate, blood flows to your extremities, you sweat, and more so, this is on the y-axis, you have amount of sweat, and taboo language over here on the far right induces much more sweating than even things like reprimands, like don't touch that. Negative language, positive language, and so on. One consequence of this suite of physiological reactions that follow swearing is that it changes your behavior. For example, Jamie here is showing us that you can tolerate pain to a degree, to a much greater degree when you're swearing. So this is an experiment that was replicated on his show, but that's also replicated a number of times in labs where if you have a person immerse their open hand in ice water and have them either assigned to a condition where they're supposed to swear or one in which they're supposed to say neutral words, you find that they can hold their hand in for about 40% longer if they're swearing. It's also been shown that strength increases during swearing. So if you have people squeeze a grip strength dynamometer, there's an increase of about 5% of grip strength. Now, there are various sorts of concrete behavioral consequences of using these special words. Of course, humans live in social environments, and swearing has not just physiological consequences, but it also has social and evaluative consequences. In a variety of studies, people have investigated what are the judgments that people bring to bear on others who they observe to be swearing. I've organized these into the more positive ones on one side and the more negative ones on the other side. And like everything, swearing is a mixed bag. People who swear are judged to be more honest. You can imagine why that might be true. More passionate, more humorous. They are also oftentimes judged to be less intelligent, less educated, and less articulate. All of these things can be believed to be true of a person at the same time. Now, whether or not they are actually correct judgments of swearers is an entirely different question, and there has been some research on that as well. And again, here I'm just going to summarize, a dozen studies. It turns out that people who swear more and swear more fluently are actually more verbally fluent in general. So that is to say, being able to find words quickly, having just the right word for the moment, knowing lots of words, all of those things apply uniformly to swearing and to the rest of vocabulary on average. People who swear more rate higher on a personality trait called openness to new experiences. They are sometimes observed to score higher in IQ tests. Again, this is all on average. They, on average, also report higher degrees of relational aggression. So that's like verbal abuse and threatening and so on. They are more socially honest in that they are more likely to say things that are socially costly, even just because they think that they're true. So more likely to tell someone that their hat is ugly if they think that it is actually ugly, despite the social consequences of doing so. But there have been a couple of studies showing that people who report swearing more are actually less financially honest, and we can talk about those results. I think we have some time for question and answer afterwards, so we can talk about those as well. In any case, there like anything that involves people, the story is quite complicated in terms of exactly what being a person who swears a lot says about you. And it's even more different when we consider differences across cultures. So North American English-speaking culture is a particular variety of culture that has particular beliefs about swearing. So we live in a culture in which swearing is bad. We call them bad words. Children are punished for using them, and people avoid using them in certain circumstances and so on. But of course, that is not universally true. There are other cultures that work different ways. Some languages and cultures have been reported to not really have any real equivalent to what we have as profanity. Japan is a great example of that. Where, you can insult people by using the wrong, honorific forms and so on. But there's no class of words that they feel need to be bleeped like we have in American English. They have some borrowed words. They borrowed the middle finger from us in the last couple of decades, but all of this is relatively new cultural innovation that has been brought to Japan. That's one side where you just don't have the concept of bad words. Another possibility is that words could be judged to be too powerful to be allowed in public with dramatic legal or social consequences. So you could think about under Sharia law in Afghanistan, parts of Afghanistan and parts of other countries, blasphemy, which is a kind of use of taboo language, is a capital crime. And maybe a third possibility, like if we're looking for the outline of the space of possible cultural settings, in France, you don't have bad words. You have fat words, big words, gros mots, and it's just generally accepted, and places like France and Germany, that those words are strong and that you use them for emotional impact and to express your emotional state, but there's no idea of censorship, right? You don't censor them. You don't taboo words don't need to be bleeped out. You don't keep from saying them around children or in the nightly news or whatever. It's just, if you're trying to express a strong emotion, then you use them, or evoke a strong emotion, you use them. So there are big cross-cultural differences. So if you want to have, if you're looking for profanity, you need to look in those cultures that actually have a concept of profanity. But we might ask, like, what? So okay, these words are really powerful in those cultures in which, in those cultures that allow them or that create them. What makes a word profane? How do you figure out which words are going to become profane? And actually, if you survey the languages of the world and you look at the words that end up in their profane lexica, you find that there are actually some very striking similarities. There are four main sources that profanity comes from. The first, and at least in the Western tradition, earliest source is religious terminology. So profanus it means in front of the church, and that's and certainly religious terminology plays a very strong role in the history of English swearing. There are a couple of English swear words that are still judged to be relatively offensive. Of course, there's a great deal of demographic variability in this, and there are certainly places in the United States, for example, where certain religious terms are still judged to be extremely offensive. What I'm showing is results here from a relatively small survey, a couple hundred people. I take a survey every year of incoming freshmen at UC San Diego and ask them about how offensive each of a number of words is. Here's just one example of results from such a study. I haven't labeled any of these circles, but each circle is a word. And there are really only a couple of religious words left in English profanity. In the history of English, there have been many more, of course. And in other languages, there are many more in Spanish and Italian and so on. In Quebecois French, and the French are spoken in Quebec, their strongest words are religious terminology. But like tabernacle and chalice, referring to sort of ideas from Catholic liturgical concepts. The other three sources are probably certainly more common in English. Copulation, I think that needs no explanation. There's a lot of variance there. Body parts, bodily functions are another category, and then slurs, which I'm just calling words for other groups of people, out-groups. Usually they're marginalized groups or groups with which there's some sort of continuing strife. And interestingly, what you might not predict if you were, say, George Carlin in the 1960s, is that at least in contemporary, in the minds of contemporary American English speakers, slurs are by far the most offensive words in the language. And that's as compared with words for copulation and bodily functions and so on. That's a change that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years, and something that we might want to talk about towards the end of the time. So, and this is true across the world languages. Although a language might select differently from these different categories, these are going to be providing the main source of profanity in any language. Some exceptions: in some languages, words for death and disease are quite offensive. Dutch is a good example, where words like tuberculosis and cancer are among their strongest words. In some languages, words for animals, and we have a couple of those in English. Chinese is a good example of that as well. Words just describing ancestors or disparaging ancestors are quite common. But on the whole, these are going to provide most of the vocabulary for profanity around the world. Now, that's not a sufficient criterion, though, right? There are lots of words describing other groups of people and bodily functions and copulation and religion that are not profanity, right? There are ways to talk about bodily functions with your doctor or your priest or your 2-year-old that are not profanity. So obviously there's got to be something else going on here. And one other thing that's going on is how they sound. So we have this idea that we've got this concept of 4-letter words in English, right? And if you do, as I did, actually go through the entire English vocabulary, so that's the light gray bars here, and count how many words are there in English on the whole at each of a number of lengths, you find this distribution, these light gray bars here. It's a nice looking distribution. And it's very different from the distribution that you get if you count profanity in English. As it turns out, this four letter thing is actually spot on. There are more than twice as many profane English words that have 4 letters than you would expect by chance, than you get in the distribution over the entire vocabulary of English. But there's some other stuff going on too. 3-letter words and 5-letter words are also more likely to be profane than you'd expect by chance. These black bars are bigger than their corresponding gray bars. And what might be going on there? Well, it's what I hinted earlier. It's not actually how the word is spelled, but how it sounds. We have in English a real heavy bulk of profane vocabulary living right in this range that is, regardless of how many letters. That's not the slide I expected to see there. That's curious. Regardless of its spelling, whether it's spelled with 3, you can imagine what I mean when I'm referring to 3-letter or 5-letter profane words. Regardless of how many letters it's spelled with, is 1 syllable long. That's what you get with 3 or 4 or 5 letters, and specifically words that end with consonants. More consonants make words appear to be more offensive to English speakers, and we've done some studies. Oh, that's curious. We've done some studies showing this, where we invent new words for people, like sploom, and compare them with words that don't have consonants at the end, like sploo. And it turns out that if you ask people, okay, we know this isn't a real word, but pretend it were, how offensive would it be? People judge the ones with more consonants, both at the beginning and at the end, to be more offensive. So we're pretty confident that, in fact, this is something that English speakers are carrying around in their heads. They like consonants, and that's not just any consonants, but they like these stop consonants in particular. The p's and t's and k's really make people think those words are offensive. So there's something about the sound structure of words that makes them seem offensive to English speakers, and other languages might have similar patterns. But of course, language is a moving target, and the words that are offensive at one particular time might not have always been offensive. In fact, they have not always been offensive, and they won't always be offensive. I'm going to quickly scroll through the list of people who are on this call to see if there is anyone named Dick here. Okay, good. It looks like I don't have anyone to directly offend. So it so happens that over the course of the last 300 years, there's been a change in English where all of a sudden people with the name Richard started to be called Dick. And that was a change that happened a long time ago. It's as a nickname, sort of in parallel with Rick and Rich and so on. But as it happens, there isn't basically anyone under the age of 65 named Dick anymore, at least not in this country. And so the one really good question, why did that happen? And the explanation, I think, is relatively straightforward. So the reason that I know that there's no one named Dick anymore is because I pulled the naming data from the Social Security Administration's name database. So they have the list of all the names. So sometimes people use this for, like, what are the name trends? You know, what's this year's most popular boy's name? It's Aiden or Jaden or whatever it is nowadays. Well, you can use this for historical trends as well. And this is how many people named their newborn baby Dick or Rick, not Richard with a nickname. This is actually on the birth certificate. And you can see it's not many. It goes up to about 800 or 900 per year in the entire country. That's not a lot, but it's still enough to make a generalization about, which is that Dick, there were lots of babies named Dick all the way up through the 1930s and 40s. And then precipitously, you see this drop-off around 1940 and 50 until at present there are 0. Each year, the report is 0 babies with a given name Dick. And Rick has experienced a similar pattern, but there are still children being named Rick. And this is obviously caused by the innovation and dissemination of a different meaning for the word dick. That different meaning came about, as far as we can tell, around the turn of the 20th century. So, a good 120 years ago, dick was used as a sort of a familiar term for just a guy. So, like in the expression Tom, Dick, and Harry, we still have it, but like just he's a regular dick. That he's a regular guy. Somehow, through military usage, it came to also refer to a riding crop. And in the 1920s, that usage started to shift to refer to the male member. Why exactly that happened, we don't fully know. It could have spread from a person, from a guy, from a male person to the male member. It could have gone from riding crop through some metaphor or something like that. We don't fully know, but it is pretty clear that that once it started to spread through general usage in the 1930s and 1940s, all of a sudden parents started deciding, well, there's a cost here. There's a social cost to naming my child this way. And as a consequence, the dicks that we all know, the sort of famous dicks are Dick Van Dyke and Dick Cheney and Dick Armitage. I'm thinking, I don't know why it's all like politicians and actors, but the dicks that we know of are were born right around in this sweet spot right here. And when I ask when I ask 100 freshmen if they know anyone named Dick, they giggle first, and then they say, "Yeah, I think my grandfather, my grandpa's tennis partner, or something." So that's a change that's happened, and this happens constantly. This is not an exception. This is just the norm. We just happen to be able to track it because we have naming data. But the same has happened for pick your favorite swear word or your least favorite swear word. At one time in the past, it did not have an offensive meaning or use in the language, and it changed. And I regret to inform you, but in 100 years, it will also not have an offensive use in the language, with the exception of maybe a couple that are particularly persistent. But almost every word in our profane vocabulary is transitioning from neutral to profane back to neutral again. Oh wait, that was the slide that I was expecting to see with this was supposed to show you sounds, and these words don't sound as offensive as these words. Okay, yes, that was what I told you results. Okay, so in sum, what makes profanity? Well, first you have to have a cultural belief that some words are bad in certain contexts. And then second, that has to be applied to specific words that are usually drawn from particular semantic fields, like sex, religion, bodily functions, and somehow other groups of people. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that those are all taboo domains of human experience, right? We have taboos about religion. Some people might say religion is all taboos, especially if you're talking to atheists. There are taboos associated with bodily functions. There are taboo beliefs associated with copulation and with other group of people. And what profanity does is it borrows from these taboo beliefs about the world and filters them into the language. It's almost as if the taboo transfers from the thing that you're thinking and talking about to the word that denotes it. But even if we had all of that, that would not be enough, because why do we have the physiological reactions that we do? Why do those words persevere? Although, only for hundreds of years. Why do they persevere for hundreds of years? There have to be some reinforcement mechanisms. A culture has to decide, okay, there's a way that we're going to imprint this belief of badness in this word inside children's heads from very early on. And so there must be some cultural structures for reinforcing those norms. That could be things like punishment. It could be censorship. It could be, I think many of us are familiar with all the different ways that people can be punished for using profanity. And this is what's really curious here. What's really interesting is that this is precisely the mechanism that creates the taboo beliefs in the first place. That it's the thing that closes the loop, that makes sure that the next generation has the same aversive and beliefs about the words themselves that the preceding generation does. This is what makes people believe that the word powerful and special and strong and bad. Because without any reinforcement, I mean, think about it. What would happen if everyone just said, okay, well, it's fine. We just use these words. Well, we don't even have to imagine what that would be like because we have it, because that's what we do with all other words. And people don't have these strong physiological and emotional reactions to all other words. So it's a very interesting circumstance where the remedy for the problem, if you want to think of it as a problem of swearing, is exactly the thing that recreates the problem itself. Okay, so that's a quick tour of some things that we know about profanity. I would now like to turn to what I promised, which is the second part where I talk about some things that we've learned about the brain and how it works and how language works and how we've evolved to be the linguistic maestros that we are from profanity that we wouldn't know otherwise. So people make errors when they're speaking. You've already heard me make a bunch of them today. There are lots of things that increase the rates of error production that people make. But there are a number of different theories about why people make speech errors. And one of them is, and probably the one that's best known both within academia and and without, is the idea that people make errors because there's something that they're thinking about that they don't want to say, right? This is maybe best associated with Sigmund Freud. And if you were to look around and just notice what errors people make, the ones that you notice are definitely more likely than chance to have this feature. And I'd like to show you just a couple of errors. You can observe these all the time. These are a couple that I observed. These are naturally produced speech errors. Let me know if this audio doesn't come through. Hopefully it would. I tried to share audio on these.
Feeling frisky.
Up next, we're going to share when your partner may be in the mood for a little romance.
And we've been the food truck fanatic all week long. Food truck.
What'd you say?
Food truck fanatic. That's what I meant to say. Gulp. High five lunch truck is here with
Yeah,
us.
high five yourself for that.
Oh boy.
Okay, so I bring this up just for two reasons. The first is these errors happen, and these are the ones that we notice, right? We notice the ones that produce taboo errors. And second, he really had no chance, right? So everything was conspiring against him. The previous segment, I don't know if you saw, the title was Feeling Frisky. The thing that he was supposed to say had the word truck surrounded by two F words, food truck fanatic. And he was reading copy about how to tell when, or she was reading copy about how to tell when your partner is in the mood for a little romance. Like everything that could possibly be lead to him making this particular error was in place. And when we try to reproduce this in the lab, we reproduce many of these conditions. We try to set it up so that it's very likely that you would make this particular slip of the tongue. Let me just give you one other example to demonstrate how persistent these are. Also from the news.
It's a sausage competition that I judge.
Oh, in like sausage eating?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. King of the Kubasa and local sausage makers, they all make their best and they enter it.
I bet it's delicious.
It is. It's February 9th, 7 p.m. at Prairie Land Park. Tickets are only $25. It's for charity, and you can get tickets online at Oh, no.
Well, you're thinking about sausage, so.
Pick a tick. Oh my goodness. That was ridiculous, wasn't it?
We were not drinking wine today.
No, we weren't. We weren't.
Now, sounds like a really good event.
It is. King of the Kubasa, so go to pickatick.com.
Yeah, these can be hard to get out of. So again, Freud would have a field day with this, right? So it's a sausage eating contest. She's the judge of the sausage eating contest. Okay, she's trying to say pick a tick. All right. So there's a real fundamental question here, right? Is this why people make speech errors? Because there's something that they're carrying around that they want to that they're thinking about and don't want to say.
It's a soft.
Sorry. And we can reproduce this in the lab. It started with a guy named Mike Motley, who was doing this in the 1980s, but these effects have replicated over and over. And he had this interesting idea. He said, well, what if we set people up to make speech errors, kind of like the food truck fanatic thing, where the error would be taboo half of the time, and in the other half of the setups, it would be a neutral error, so it wouldn't be taboo in any way. And you just see how often they make errors. If Freud is right, then people should be more likely to make errors in the taboo circumstance. And I just banged my microphone. So let's see what happens. Is Freud right? Well, it turns out that in each of these studies, the first two studies, but this has been replicated over and over, it turns out that people make more errors higher up on the y-axis here. People make more errors in the neutral condition. More than twice as many, and sometimes much more than twice as many errors in the neutral condition than the taboo condition. They're not making food fuck fanatic mistakes. They're specifically avoiding making food fuck fanatic mistakes. So not only does this not comport with this idea that people are making mistakes because of something they're trying to suppress, it actually suggests something different, that they're actually successfully suppressing the errors that would be socially costly, and they're not suppressing the other ones. The most common errors are the neutral ones. And there's been some neuroscience trying to look at this as well. So if you have people perform this same task while they're in an Fmri machine, and you look at the difference between when they're inhibiting the taboo errors versus the neutral errors, you find the only difference is this tiny little spot here. This is where there's a difference in the signal in the Fmri machine. Fmri measures blood flow to particular regions in the brain. This is the part of the brain where the signal is biggest, where the signal difference is biggest. And this part actually is not just a random part of the brain that I'm showing you. It has a name. It's the right inferior frontal gyrus. And in fact, we know exactly what this part of the brain does. It does inhibitory control. So every time that you think, I'm a little peckish, and then you don't reach for chocolate cake. Every time that you don't, I don't know what you would successfully inhibit doing. Every time that you see a fire engine driving past, and you successfully don't start driving so that you don't get in the way of the fire engine. Every time you inhibit control, you're using this part of the brain. And so what this tells us is actually something quite fascinating about language. It seems like, and we didn't know this before, that people are self-monitoring. So we are constantly predicting what we're going to say. And we're monitoring what that's going to sound like. And if it's going to be something problematic, if it's going to be something that we think is going to have a social cost, then we pull the brakes. And this part of the brain is responsible for doing that pulling of the brakes. It doesn't do all the monitoring, but it does the brake pulling. And this monitoring system is something totally new. We didn't know that, there'd been some theory like maybe we do something like that, but we didn't know until people started discovering it through taboo language, exactly how it worked. And there's other evidence for this self-monitoring system, which also comes, interestingly, from taboo language. So a task that's used very commonly in psycholinguistics is called picture word interference. And it's a very simple task. You basically just show people a picture with a word printed on it, and the word is unrelated to the picture. And the participant's job is just to say what the picture is of. What is this a picture of? And so I will give you an example of this task. So your job is to say as quickly as possible, what is the picture? Remember, ignore the word. Word has nothing to do with the task. Okay, so ready, set, and you're going to say the word. I'm sorry, you're going to say what the picture is. Ready, set, go. Okay, you should have said dog, or maybe you said, I don't know what that is, a lab or a retriever or something like that. Okay, so people take some amount of time with this. And what's been discovered is that if you do this again, so let's do this again, you can try to say the name of a picture as quickly as possible. Here, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so what people find is that if you put a taboo word on top of a picture, people take significantly longer to say that word, to say the word dog or cat or whatever it is. And this is more evidence that people are self-monitoring, right? They know, okay, there's a possibility I'm going to say this wrong word. And if that wrong word is going to be taboo, then I really need to slow down this process, make sure I don't make a mistake, and say the right word. And so as a consequence, people don't make more errors with the taboo words, but they do take longer, right? Because they are, again, they're hitting the brakes. Okay, so that's one thing that we've learned from looking at taboo language. We've learned that there is a self-monitoring system. The brain has this ability. It's using some old tools and some new tools and combining them together, but it has this ability to pre-check what a person is going to say and to either avoid making errors or to slow down the process so as to ensure that the appropriate signal gets out. The last bit that I wanted to talk about is actually much more fundamental, and it has to do with what precisely the centers are of the brain. What exactly in the brain is being used for language production? Now, if you take an intro psychology class or an intro neuroscience class or anything like that, you will learn about a couple of parts of the brain that are specifically used for language. They're usually in the left hemisphere of people's brains, although about 2 to 5% have it in the right hemisphere. And they have they're named after dead white guys. So Broca's area is in the front of the brain. So this is over here. So this is the side of your brain, the left side of your brain, with scalp and hair and skull removed. This is the front here. Your eyes would be down here. So this is a part called Broca's area, named after a French physician who first discovered that people who had damage to this area had trouble producing language. If you know people who have aphasia, so a difficulty with language, usually due to either a traumatic brain injury or disease, strokes are the most common cause nowadays. Many people with aphasia have what's called Broca aphasia or production aphasia, and it's known that Broca's area is involved in the production of speech, basically putting words and sounds together to make fluent speech. Another area that we know is quite strongly implicated in language is Wernicke's area, which seems to be involved in putting meanings together with the sounds of words, so either understanding words or making meaningful sentences. So if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you might have trouble understanding what people are saying to you. You might also produce language that, although it sounds fluent, kind of sounds like it's kind of gibberish, right? It's just sequences of words that don't really mean much. And again, if you read an introductory psychology textbook, they'll say, well, these are the main language centers, and they are evolutionarily new in that they are different from the homologous regions in any other species, including our closest primate relatives. They do things that other animals can't do. So language is something that other animals can't do, at least anything like what human language is like. And they're quite special, and they're part of our sort of evolutionary, the evolutionary gifts that we have. But what about profanity? So it turns out that when you look at people with aphasia, you find that profanity doesn't quite look like the rest of language. And we've known this for a couple hundred years, starting with this dead white guy. This is Dr. and Professor Jacques Lordat, who was a French physician. He had a stroke and ended up losing almost all of his ability to produce language, but recovered it. Even though he was in his 50s when he suffered the stroke, he nevertheless recovered, which is quite remarkable. And he dedicated the rest of his career to studying people who, like him, had lost the ability to produce language, so Broca's aphasics. And one of his most famous subjects was a parish priest. This was in France. And according to Lordat's report, the priest lost all of his language. He could not say a single word of French, except for two words, the word je, which means I, and this is my translation, the most forceful oath of the tongue, which begins with an F and which our dictionaries have never dared to print. So he could say the F word in French, and he could say I, and that was it. This was a priest. And we've known for a long time that as you look at aphasia cases, this repeats over and over. There are many people with Broca's aphasia who lose the ability to produce language fluently, but they can still swear. And so that tells us that there's something going on that's different in the brain for profanity than for the rest of language. And you might ask, okay, well, so he had damage to his left Broca's area. What exactly is the part of the brain then that can continue to produce profanity even when Broca's area is missing? When this evolutionary endowment that we have for abstract, complex language and reasoning is impaired, we can still swear. What is happening in the brain? We get a hint of that by looking at another patient by the name of, well, pseudonymized anyways, as EC. EC was, again, an adult male in his 60s, I believe, who had a malignant tumor over his left frontal cortex. And it was removed, but the cells were still malignant, and it continued to grow. And ultimately, his physician decided that the best course of action was the decision of last resort, was a radical left hemispherectomy. So that's the removal of the entire left hemisphere of the brain. And as you can imagine, this completely obliterates your ability to produce language and understand it. He did survive though, and according to EC's doctor, this was EC. Although EC could not produce much of language, this is what would happen when he tried immediately after surgery. EC's attempts to reply to questions immediately after operation were totally unsuccessful. He would open his mouth and utter isolated words, and after apparently struggling to organize words for meaningful speech, recognized his inability and would utter expletives or short emotional phrases like "God damn it." Expletives and curses were well articulated and clearly understandable. So what this says is it's not just some other part of the left hemisphere of the brain, some other part of cortex. It's like maybe swearing is just like next door to the rest of language. No, this is something totally different. You don't even have to have your left hemisphere to swear. Okay, so where is it? Well, what we need is something that's kind of the opposite of EC. We need to find a case where someone has some sort of brain impairment that, again, it could be traumatic brain injury, it could be disease that knocks out just swearing and preserves the rest of language. And if we knew where in the brain that person had their deficiency, then we would start to have a clue about where profanity is housed. And we do have a few such cases. The syndrome is called automatic aphasia, and it's basically where you lose the ability to say things that you say automatically and spontaneously. So this can include nursery rhymes. You lose the ability to sing nursery rhymes, to count to 10, and to swear. And there are not many cases of this, but one such case is an Israeli citizen who's I believe a French, Hebrew, English multilingual, who once again had a stroke, but in this case, who preserved all of language except that he could not provide the correct expletive for situations described to him, nor could he complete a curse. And so here's the big reveal. Now, what part of this patient's brain was damaged? So it turns out that it was, now I've put it in light gray here because it's actually not on the surface of the brain at all. It's a part of the brain that's sort of deep in the ancient center of the brain called the basal ganglia, part of the limbic system. The basal ganglia are responsible for selecting and suppressing actions on the basis of strong emotions. So you can think of it as part of the fight or flight system. And so this patient had damage to the basal ganglia. Now, there's other reason to believe that the basal ganglia are implicated in swearing more generally. Tourette syndrome is a movement disorder that affects millions of people around the world. And one of the symptoms of Tourette syndrome in about 10 to 50% of the cases is coprolalia. Coprolalia is the uncontrollable production of taboo words and phrases. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Tourette syndrome. I wanted to just give you an example of what it looks like. This is a student who who suffers from Tourette syndrome and decided to record himself just to sort of show the world what it's like living with it. Here is some video of him.
Fuck 'em. Oh my god. Fuck you.
So coprolalia is as I said, is not implicated. It's not involved in the majority of cases of Tourette. What we do is that in the main difference to neurotypical people is in fact in the basal ganglia. So it's true that so we don't exactly know what's different about it, but we know that there's different density and different connectivity in the basal ganglia of people who have Tourette syndrome. And so we believe that that's part of what causes this uncontrollable swearing in Tourette syndrome. And also when you have damage to the basal ganglia, what leads to the impairment of the ability to produce automatic language. And so the upshot of all this, and this is what conclude, is that from profanity specifically, although it seems unlikely, we've actually learned something about how language has evolved in our species. There are actually two pathways for people to produce words and phrases. There's the new one that we knew about that involves the cerebral cortex, evolutionarily new. We can think of ourselves as superior in all kinds of ways to other animals. And certainly these are systems that we know we can trace the evolutionary development of over millions of years. But there's also an old system. And that old system is one that we share in large part with not only other primates and mammals, but with other vertebrates, where the basal ganglia plays a role in generating vocalizations on the basis of emotions. So when your dog yelps in excitement because you're home, or out of pain because you accidentally stepped on her tail, she is using her basal ganglia to produce a vocalization that expresses an emotion and induces a reaction in others. And the same is true of us. We have that vocalization pathway. It's a little bit different in the dog because she speaks dog, we speak a particular language, and so our vocalizations are tailored to the particular cultural context that we're in, whether that's learning English or Chinese or Spanish or sign language or whatever it is. But interestingly, we actually have these two different ways to generate language. That's something that we didn't actually know otherwise. So just to conclude, there is actually a cognitive science of profanity, and there are things that it reveals about us, our social lives, our evolutionary history, our neurophysiology that we wouldn't know otherwise. And it may be worth inquiring a little bit more. To do so, of course, we need to get over the taboos about using these words and studying them in the first place. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, great. Thanks for taking off the list.
Okay, I see there are a bunch of, so I don't know, what is your standard practice? I see that there's a bunch in the chat here. Do you prefer to go through by raised hands or the chat? What's the preferred mode here?
It's been raised hands in the past.
Okay, sounds great. So I guess I can see in the participants list. It looks like Joe, you had your hand up first.
Oh, all right. Perfect. I have two very quick questions. Sometime about 40 or 50 years ago, I read about some culture that didn't have any profanity, and in order to relieve themselves of the urge, they would pull out or cut off a tuft of hair and tie it to a post or a tree, and they had whole bushes that looked like they were made out of hair, actually. Are you familiar with that? Have you ever heard of them?
I haven't, and I would think that I would have. If you, it sounds like fiction, but if you, but I would love to know about it if it's not. So
It's got to be
if you,
50 years ago, that piece of information. I read it in some newspaper somewhere. Okay, last question. I have heard also that the word I is the most commonly used word on the planet, and the word fuck is second. Is that sound about right?
not in English, no, unfortunately.
No, I mean
Uh,
globally. In all of
you mean so you mean the translation equivalents of those?
Yes, right.
No, no, they wouldn't be.
No.
No, the most frequent words are actually function words. So they're really banal things like the and to um and so on. So yeah, no, they're certainly not the most frequent. They're not even the most frequent nouns and verbs. The most frequent, so I is the most frequent pronoun, and so it's in there. It's in the top. It's maybe in the top 10 in English. There are languages that don't actually use it much. So Japanese, for example, you don't use it much. Spanish, Italian. There are lots of languages that drop the I, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if I were in the top 10 internationally. Nonetheless, fuck would not break the top.
I've been
100.
in, I haven't been all over the world, but I've never met anyone in any of about a dozen different countries who didn't know the word fuck instantly.
Oh, I guess. Well, maybe maybe you're asking. I misinterpreted your question. I thought you meant frequent, like how often it's used total. Like you would just count up the uses of it. But
I did,
maybe.
more or less.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, unfortunately not. I mean, it. Fuck might be a word that many people are familiar with around the world, but certainly not more so than I think okay. Um, or lots of other sort of international words, unfortunately. But if you find that reference to a society that ties hair onto a bush instead of swearing, I would love to hear about that.
I tried to find it prior to this meetup and couldn't. That's
Yeah.
why I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, sorry. Looks like Gary is next.
Right, thank you. There are two things. One that came to thought several years ago, we hosted an international student from Spain, and she came armed and prepared with lots of English swear words from her friends at home who told her that would ingratiate herself to the Americans. So that sense of anxiety and emotion around the swear words was validated when I think about that experience with the student. The thing I'd raised my hand for was to direct you back to the chat to a 5:30 post and to pay appropriate compliment to Mike Polich. I think he's really smart, and he's got a couple of good comments on there. I want to make sure that his data gets in front of you. And as we might say in some legislative body, I yield the floor to Michael.
Great. Is this the comment that says, is there any correlation between the perception of profanity and the religiosity of the society? Is that the one that you're getting at, Gary? Well, Michael, did you did you want to?
I don't want to jump the line, but I guess I could. It's just a few questions that kind of came to mind when you were talking.
Yeah.
One, I'm kind of wondering, do these findings hold true for near swear words? So, for instance, like if someone says darn instead of damn.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, you don't get the increase in heart rate or blood pressure or sweating, skin conductance. You don't get the increased, you don't get the hypoalgesic effect. That's the decrease of pain. You don't get the increased strength. You get none of those effects. Yeah, people have tested that.
Okay, and I was also wondering too, is it for these findings, because you were saying, like with the Mythbusters, he has hand in ice cold water and he's swearing. I mean, has there been any sort of studies to find out whether this is more with the context that the words are spoken in rather than the words themselves? Like if he had his hand in the water and he was saying non-swear words.
Yeah, so non-swear words are usually the control condition. So so yeah, there's an increase in pain tolerance, both as measured by the amount of time they're able to hold their hand in and the pain rating that they give. So they're asked afterwards to say how much did this hurt from 1 to 7, and both of those increase when you're swearing as compared both to the sort of pseudo swear words that you were talking about, the darns and so on, and when compared to neutral words like tree.
Okay. And plus, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I always wonder about like the cross-cultural validity of all these findings. And one thing that was struck me was you were saying, like, I think it was the Japanese, you said didn't really have swear words. So I was wondering if there's like any sort of correlation between this and the religiosity of the society. Like, for instance, do proselytizing, societies where proselytizing religions are more dominant, do they have a dimmer view of swearing versus someone like Japan that doesn't have a proselytizing dominant religion?
Don't know the answer. I can say that, we know the history of cultural beliefs about profanity in certain cases, and we can track them to religiosity in those cases. So we know, for example, that that beliefs about that language taboos in the West, for example, do stem originally from taboos about religious terminology. We know that in the history of English, words about copulation and bodily functions and so on didn't start becoming taboo until the 18th or 19th century, whereas religious terminology was definitely taboo, at least used in ways that were judged to be unsuitable hundreds of years before. And thousands in some cases. So we know that that's where the idea of these language taboos comes from. I mean, you can even think about, in Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of the name of God being something that you can't utter or write. That's kind of the Ur taboo. But no, I don't know that we can say anything about whether. So that's kind of like the historical origins, and certainly there's nothing quite like that in Japanese, in traditional Japanese religion. But no, I don't know that we can say anything about like a cultural setting of religiosity or type of religiosity as it correlates with the attitude towards profanity. I haven't seen anything that systematically looks at that.
Okay, thanks.
Jim, you've been very patient.
Thank you. However, I feel I've been well rewarded already for the preceding. In any case, do you believe that people who have a pronounced tendency to use swear language on a regular basis become unable to realize the full force of it? In other words, there's been a lessening of the emotional intensity that that swearing serves as an outlet for. I know
Yes.
some individuals like that.
There's some evidence that that's true. So if you imagine let's just take the what's called the cold presser task. It's the task where you stick your hand in ice water. That's been done a couple of times. Asking people afterwards, oh, by the way, how much do you swear in your everyday life? And it's a correlational study, and it's self-reporting. We don't actually know if they're reporting truthfully or accurately. But the finding is that people who report swearing more in their everyday lives gain less benefit from swearing in the ice water task. So that is, if you don't swear much, or if you report not swearing much, then you will show the greatest benefit from swearing in terms of pain tolerance. So that's definitely consistent with the idea that you're suggesting that it may be that you use up all your swear words, like you use up the power, you become inured to them, and at that point you no longer gain the same benefit, presumably because the same physiological reaction isn't happening. You're not activating your sympathetic nervous system and all the adrenaline and all the stuff that happens as a consequence of that.
One other question, and that is sign language.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah. there are many signed languages around the world. The one that's most common in the United States is American Sign Language, and there is profanity in ASL. It's a little bit complicated though. Most of the swear words in ASL are actually also neutral words, and they are just signed differently. So it's kind of like if you had a word that meant both copulate and fuck, and depending on your intonation, depending on how loudly you said it or the pitch that you said it with, it would mean one or the other. And that's what it's like. So the difference is it's the same sign generally, but it has different dynamics. So you do it faster or harder, or you do it with a particular facial expression that shows disgust or something like that. And those are all they're kind of like the intonation of signed languages. And yeah, so there are a couple of words that are sort of like manufactured swear words in sign languages, but they're not really the taboo ones. So people learn, they learn bullshit and stuff like that. This is bullshit, right? They learn that's a taboo word. And it's really not a taboo word. It's a manufactured sort of fun word.
Thank you.
Yeah. Looks like next is Brent.
Yeah, I was thinking, have there been measurements of people's response to other people using swear words, as opposed to people using them themselves, and possibly any changes to that having to do with, like Jim said, about getting used to them?
Let me think for a second. Not directly that I can think of. There's lots of sort of indirect evidence. So people who report engaging with more media that has profanity in it also judge profanity to be less offensive. But there's kind of a chicken and egg question, right? You don't know if they're watching blue shows because they don't mind the profanity, or if they don't mind the profanity because they're watching the blue shows, right? Certainly the two are correlated. There's also this sort of indirect evidence with the changes in people's attitudes. So if you track people's judgments on these surveys, as I've been for a decade, you see that certain words are becoming less and less offensive to younger Americans. In particular, the word fuck is now not offensive to young Americans. It is I think this last year it was number 23 most offensive word in the language. And this has been happening alongside an increased democratization of media, where, if you're gaming online, as many of them are, and if you're on Twitter, as many of them are, and if you're watching YouTube videos as your main source of video, then because all of that is completely uncensored and there's lots of swearing and all of that, there's this possible causal explanation that you just grow up thinking these aren't bad words, and kind of in the same way that every generation does. My generation, so I'm in my 40s, my generation grew up thinking that the word sucks was not particularly offensive, but we just knew our parents hated it. Every generation has that. So this generation's fuck would have been my generation's sucks. And for each of you might imagine what was the one word that your friends thought was totally not a problem at all that your parents seem to get upset about. There's that seems to kind of always be happening, and largely it's a product of the frequency in the input. How often do you hear and see those words from the places that you hear and see language? Historically, that would have been peer groups. Now it's peer groups and it's online media. But yeah, there's not been a direct study of that I know of.
Opportunity.
What's that?
I said opportunity.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, it's a little tricky. to get an institutional review board to approve playing a lot of profanity for people, and then measuring if there are outcomes. There are people have very strong beliefs about the negative consequences of profanity, but you could probably get it through. Yes, Bill.
A couple of thoughts come to my mind. One is the thinking back to the good old days when Gone with the Wind was the most profane language ever heard on a movie. And I can remember going to movies and sort of being not shocked, but distracted by the language that was in the movie. Now I go to the movies, and if I don't hear profanity of the most extreme form that I can hear it over and over and over again, then I walk out of the movie saying, you know, there wasn't any profanity in that movie. That was really shocking. So we've gone through this whole cycle from 1940 to now, which is not a very long period in human history. And obviously people do get used to hearing certain words. And you mentioned a little while ago about your about some words that have longevity and that they have lasted for centuries. And why do they last? I guess that's the question.
Yeah. So yeah, to your first point, absolutely. There's been a lot of change in the last century, let's say, and what I don't know is how much, whether that's more or less change than it happened in the, let's say, the preceding century, because the preceding century you have like the advent of Victorian beliefs about cleanliness and propriety and the all the changes that happened along with that in terms of our beliefs about language, and talking about copulation and talking about bodily functions and so on. I think change is the only constant is basically the upshot. But yes, people can become inured to the language that they're exposed to. To your second point, wait, what was your second point? Shoot, I started talking and then I forgot.
The language changing over that period of time so rapidly, and is it like, what keeps a word in play longer?
Yeah. So sometimes it's because there's an underlying cause for that word to be offensive that doesn't change. So the most offensive word, according to the surveys, all the surveys that I've seen of American English, is the N word, and that is not selected arbitrarily, right? So that word comes with a long history of discrimination and unequal access and marginalization. And unless that changes, there is still going to be social power behind the use of words that marginalize the targeted individuals. And so as long as the social conditions don't change, the word's not going to lose its power. There are other words that are relatively long-lasting. So fuck is a good example of that. It's been a couple centuries now that it's been quite powerful. I think that words like a few of them, shit is another good example, but there aren't many, that have persisted, are sort of prototypical in lots of ways. They sound right. They are the right length. They target a particular domain of experience that remains taboo and has remained taboo for hundreds of years. And they've also diversified their range of possible uses. So, words like fuck and shit can go into absolutely any particular kind of sentence configuration you want. You can use them as verbs. You can use them as nouns. You can use them as adverbs if you want to. And they've sort of dissociated themselves in terms of their use from their original function. There's kind of like linguistic spice. And once that happens, they become part of the furniture. They become part of just the things that you know about the language include a dozen 2 dozen, 3 dozen expressions that use this word. And so it's not a matter of just like eradicating the use of or tiring of the use, one particular use of a word. Instead, it's so pervasive. It's in the skeleton of the language in so many different ways that that the word can persist. Gary.
Thank you. Just before we go, I want to thank you, and I'm sure others say the same, and ask for about 15 seconds. You talked a little bit about the book, and Joe provided a fine introduction, but how did you get to where you are? Are you an English person that morphed into this? Are you a social scientist? Where did this all come from? How'd you end up with this as your life's calling?
Well, yeah. So fortunately, I also have a much more diversified portfolio. This is just one of the many things that I do. I look at language more generally. I'm a cognitive scientist by training, and I do experiments on looking at how people produce language and understand language, and sometimes learn language. And I got into this in particular as a kind of as a sort of a route that I thought would allow me to engage more people with what I really care about, the study of language and cognition in the brain. You know, I was teaching an undergraduate introduction to language class, and 18-year-olds don't care about syntactic trees, and they don't care about language change, but I noticed they really perked up when we talked about infixes in English. And an infix is where you stick a word into another word. Because it turns out that the only infixes in English are taboo. So it's things like chatta-fucking nouga and unfucking believable and so on. And I thought, well, you could actually, if this works on 18-year-olds, then it's definitely going to work on educated, scientifically interested adults. And so I thought, well, is there a way to use language as an invitation to understanding more about the stuff that I care about? And to engage more people with it. And so that's how I started getting interested in it, and discovered that there was a whole science to it, and started to do some of that science myself. It's not sort of truth in advertising. It's not the largest part of my scientific activities, but it is definitely at this point the largest part of my science outreach activities, because I think it's a way to sort of bring people back. I got you to listen to me talking about Wernicke's area and Broca's area, and I don't know if I would have been able to do that if I hadn't advertised this as a talk about swearing. So that's the true history.
Great question, Gary. Jim is next. You're muted, Jim.
Amy's next.
Okay, Amy.
Thank you very much for this lecture. It had me laughing out loud several times, and not at you. And I went to, in Dallas, Texas, I often attended George and Laura Bush's Methodist church, because they had a Cornerstone series, and they had an author who came in and talked about cuss words and it was amazing, because he emptied out the auditorium, I'd say by 50% within the first 10 minutes. And I was hysterical laughing just watching these people, just almost having a physical response for him, just saying words matter-of-factly. And so that was pretty entertaining as well. I actually wrote the young pastor a note the next day, or an email, saying I hope he didn't get in trouble, because he didn't know what the lecture was going to be about, because so many people did walk out. So, but anyway, so as when you were talking about some of your categories of I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, so when you say minorities, or the type of slur it may be against the group, or whatever it may be, I've never seen one category in terms of sexism. You don't separate that out in terms of maybe, because I think there's a lot of sexist humor out there. A lot.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So it's almost like, it seems like that, slurs against women any kind of, should almost be its own category. But
Yeah. So I just want to, just to agree with you. Yes, that is definitely a major source of the most offensive words in many languages. And yeah, I would put that under that same category of groups of other people, particularly those that are out groups, those who are in particular marginalized in whatever
how
way.
can we be an out group if we're 50% of the population?
Oh yeah. So out group and in group just means with respect to the person who's using the language. So I have a set of in groups. Like this is the way that sort of sociologists talk about it. Your in group is the groups that you identify with and that would identify you as being one of them. So I have a variety of in groups, and there are many for me out groups. So women is an out group for me. Black people is an out group for me, and so any of those groups. So we have words that specifically target others, target the other, and yes, of course, women are, as you correctly point out, an out group for 49% of the population. And because of the history of marginalization and disparate or unequal access, yes, there have been lots of very strong words. If I'd put the labels on those dots in that graph that you saw, you would have seen a lot of words that I think you would recognize there in that category.
I just attended a lecture, though, that said that when studying the brain, that women's brains and men's brains can function very differently, and they need to be taken into account in a lot of, like, even just drug studies. What is the chance of this kind of reaction if you're female? That's going to be a much higher maybe side effect, etc. But that's not being studied in most drug studies. And this was a neuroscientist, and she was saying it really should be, because the differences can be very big.
Thank you, Amy. Jim, I accidentally lowered your hand, Jim, so if you want to go ahead. Sorry.
Alrighty. Well, first of all, a question for Amy. Did she happen to notice whether or not George Bush was covered with hair as stuff on him at various points? Well, never mind. Unless you know the answer. This is alluding to an earlier portion of the conversation. At any rate, let's see, what was I going to say in all seriousness?
I raised my hand.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat, and then we'll get to your question. I see you raising your hand. Even though you're not doing it electronically, we will answer your question in just a moment.
I will defer to the speaker who wants to go next.
Okay.
Thank you.
You can unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Is swearing good for you?
It depends. I think that there are certainly cases where it can be helpful. After I wrote the book, I was contacted by a woman who actually from Florida, who was taking care of her elderly mother, and her mother had unspecified dementia, and was in a home, and according to the woman who wrote to me, was experiencing a relatively frustrating life because she was unable to do much. She was unable to move her body much and unable to say much of anything. And so she noticed that her mother really came to life when she swore. And she started doing this thing where she would take her out in the wheelchair across the parking lot so that no one could hear. And she would just say, "Mom, we're going to do swear therapy." And they would just swear together. And she believed that it was cathartic. And I don't see any reason to believe that she was wrong. And I think that a lot of people have this experience of catharsis with swearing, that it serves to substitute for other sorts of means of expression, in some cases maybe productively. And it certainly has a function, right? Like given a society and the culture in which we have these strong beliefs about language and about how we're supposed to express emotions and so on, it certainly can be useful and pro-social in many cases to swear many comedians would not have the success that they have, and many amateur comedians too. So people might not just be judged to be as funny if they didn't work blue. People forge social relationships on the basis of creating a feeling of familiarity and kinship. Oftentimes, the best way to do that, especially in tight-knit groups of people, is through the use of informal language like swearing. So yeah, there are certainly benefits, but of course, it's like nuclear power. There are lots of downsides too, right? You can be judged negatively for using profanity. You could lose an opportunity, a job opportunity. You could lose a friend if you swear the wrong way or in the wrong circumstance. So I think that it's a sort of a textured. I can't give you a thumbs up, thumbs down answer. I can just say it's a powerful thing that seems to have some benefits and some drawbacks, and like pretty much all powerful things.
Thank you, Ben. I would like to go ahead and ask the question in the chat that Roland asked, which was, have you seen the emergence of new profane words? What is the next buck?
Oh, yeah, we can track them. I mean, the next one, I can't necessarily predict what the next one's going to be. I can predict what it's likely to sound like. It's likely to be one syllable with lots of consonants, particularly stop consonants, particularly at the end. I can predict that it's going, although not necessarily, right? There are lots of other possibilities, but it has a higher chance of being that than of being other things. It's going to target out group members, or it's going to be drawn from sex or bodily functions. And so we see some such words starting to emerge now. So, 20 years ago, we got the word MILF, which conforms to all those criteria. Cuck is a pretty recent one. It's a shortening, it's an abbreviation of cuckold. It's used on the internet to describe usually people who are believed to be male and liberal as being weak and effeminate. Yeah, but there are others like that sort of emerge every once in a while, and you can track them. Thought is one. THOT is a derogatory term for women. It's like MILF. It's an abbreviation for that hoe over there. That's pretty well known now among the sort of under 30 set. Spurg is one you might not be familiar with, but it's an abbreviation of Asperger's. It's a derogatory term for people with Asperger's syndrome. So I mean they're coming all the time. They are remarkably predictable, although you can't predict which specific one they're going to be. You can sort of describe the contours of what they're going to be like.
Thank you very much. Jim Young, you're next.
I found the discussion and the presentation very educational and interesting, but one of the things that I've been pondering while I've been listening is the emotional reactions that not only words, supposedly profane words or cuss words, but topics of conversations or statements that someone might make concerning a taboo topic. So there's certain topics when people, let's say if we're sitting at a table and there's a mixed group of people, and you bring up the topic of sex, some of the people sitting at the table will have no problem with it. Others will have a very strong reaction to that topic. Or if you make a comment, such as one I made once while sitting in a group of mixed company, I made the statement that somebody asked, in response to a question, somebody asked me if I thought that extramarital sex or premarital sex was evil. And I responded by saying that abstinence was not viewed, in my opinion, to be a virtue. And a gasp went up in the room that let me know that at least 2/3 of the people sitting there did not share that particular viewpoint. So I see more today that people are triggered not so much by a word, but by an idea.
We live in interesting times. It's certainly true that there's heterogeneity of beliefs, including moral beliefs, and I guess to the extent that people are interacting more with people with a more diverse group of people, they are going to encounter that more. That is something that current life affords. At the same time, there's also a sort of tribalization that's happening, which probably doesn't describe your situation, but I think describes the kind of majority case for when that happened, when that's happening right now, where people decide that a particular behavior, a particular belief, or a particular attitude, or a particular kind of behavior is unacceptable and not only just like to be avoided, but it needs to be suppressed. And yeah, that's certainly something that we haven't seen for a while around here. But it's certainly going on. That I fully agree. That extends to lots of stuff other than language. Language is part of it. So you may have seen that a very prominent writer for the New York Times was fired last month for using the N-word, and in a context that was very hard to discern from the differing accounts of it. But it was not actually using the word to describe someone, but was asking about the use of the word. So he was asking, did someone say the N-word? And so I think it's still true that, at least for some words, the attitudes are not merely about the act of the behavior or the belief, but are still also about the word. But not exclusively. That is not an exclusive purview of words. It's a good point.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, and I want to jump ahead to Rick and Andrea since they haven't had a chance to ask a question. I'd like to make sure everybody gets a chance to participate as much as they can. And then if you have time to stay, we'll go back to Michael and Joe who have questions also. So Rick, if you could ask a question.
Okay. When you started talking a long time ago about impulse control, the first thing that came to my mind, I have a brief introduction to psychology and stuff, was Phineas Gage. But his injury was on the opposite side of the head, from what I understand. You said it was the inferior right
inferior frontal gyrus.
Gyrus or something? Yeah, his was primarily on the left side. Is there another region of the brain involved in impulse control that you're familiar with?
So yeah, so both of the inferior frontal gyri are involved in
both sides.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He had a bunch of other stuff going on. So if you recall, the 6-foot metal bar pierced his entire skull, and it sort of went up from below his cheek up through the frontal lobe on the where's my left side through the left side, and hit a bunch of frontal material there too. So it was a lot of it wasn't just a gyrus. It was many. It was a lot of tissue that he was losing, and it led to difficulty planning. It wasn't just impulse control. It was also difficulty planning, difficulty doing sort of social reasoning, and lots of stuff like that. But yes, it's a good example.
Thank you, Rick. I accidentally lowered Andrea's hand instead of Rick. So Andrea, you have a question?
Yes, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. It takes me back to my college days when I was getting a degree in speech and language pathology. So my question is, do you think there is a relationship between stuttering and Tourette?
I don't know of a connection. I don't know a physiological connection. I know that they both have similar comorbidities. So people with Tourette syndrome are more likely than neurotypical people to also be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And people with stuttering are, I believe, more likely to be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So there may be some sort of personality characteristics, some physiological differences, some neurotypes that are in common across them. But I don't actually know of any. I don't know of any work showing that people with stuttering are more likely to have Tourette's or vice versa. There's kind of a family resemblance, but I don't know of much more than that. Maybe you can tell me.
Actually, the research I haven't been in touch with research in like 40 years, so I can't really tell you. I've always thought possibly there was some relationship, but now I'm glad I didn't miss my calling to do a paper on that. There is none.
There might not be. TBD.
I don't know if you have time to stay for a little longer, Dr. Bergen.
Sure.
Okay, Michael.
I kid all morning, so I get a couple hours off here.
Okay.
Amy just kind of reminded me of a question I had earlier for these results where the women were much more, insulted, I guess, by the swear words. Have these been controlled by who's doing the insulting? Like, for instance, like a man is insulting a woman, or a woman is insulting a woman, or a child is insulting you, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So if you just ask people how offensive do they find words, it's actually it turns out that gender doesn't actually play much of a role, and that's overall. For specific words, it will play a role. We know that there are some gender differences. So people judge women who swear more negatively on average than men who swear. In particular, men judge women who swear in front of men to be more negatively than men who swear in front of women. The same is true of women. They make the same judgments about women who swear in front of men. It ends up getting very complicated very fast. But it's clear that there are certain sort of gender stereotypes that play into the judgments about who should be saying what when. And so one other piece of data that I have is just on frequency of swearing. There's quite a good lot of evidence showing that there's not a big gender difference in the frequency of swearing across genders, except in mixed gender circumstances. So if you have a group of women, they swear about as much as men swear in a group of men, but in mixed groups, men tend to swear more than women. You can, I guess, cultural anthropologists could tell us a lot about exactly what that means about social mores and about gender role expectations. But I think that that's probably all tied up in that.
Okay.
Joe, we'll go back to you. You had your hand up a while ago.
Thank you, Judy. I had a question about Tourette's, which Andrea addressed that. It happened when I was younger. I knew a gentleman who, he wasn't much of a gentleman, but he had Tourette's. And he was a fixture in downtown St. Petersburg. He was known as Crazy Louie. Of course, that was a long time ago. But it was, and I have a cousin who had Tourette's, and I've only known them briefly, but they're dangerous to be around because it's not the profanity, it's they hurl racial slurs just as readily as they do profanity, at least the ones I knew. Any comment on Tourette's and how it should be dealt with?
Yeah, so as you say, people with coprolalia, they cannot control what the words are that they say. And oftentimes they will be things like racial slurs, and they feel terrible about it. Many of them do, and report that they just change their behavior. So that can mean things like not going out in public, or not taking a job that requires them to interact with others, or sometimes there's strategies that people will report being able to adopt where they They can't change the fact that they're going to say the word, but they can sort of shape the word after they've started saying it. So there's an example of a man who's a father, actually, who has a YouTube channel. He talks about how he deals about living with Tourette's, and he talks about how his word is cock. He just can't not say that. It's just his sort of default. He's constantly saying it, but when he's around other people, he's able to change the end of the word, so he says cop. And it's less weird. I mean, it's still weird for someone to be saying cop all the time, but it's less problematic socially, as you say, Joe. So, those are the main things. Now, there are a variety of types of therapy that people are trying with Tourette syndrome that include things like brain stimulation and some pharmaceutical interventions. There's no magic, there's no silver bullet at this point, unfortunately.
Thank you, Joe. Amy, and then Jim Peterson's going to get the last question. Oh, I thought you still had a question, Jim.
So,
Amy?
being an atheist, I came from a Jewish background, and I love the Yiddish curses that some of my great aunts and friends of friends or whatever's Yiddish speakers, and so the curses that they said, I guess, were really like curses, not so much just a curse word. They had whole, go shit in the ocean. That one was my favorite. And I was like, that really says it all, doesn't it? I guess you're not interested. Thank you. That type of thing that I think maybe was more creative. What do you think about those kind of old-fashioned curses? And I know my my friend's Nonna had all sorts of curses that she would yell at the kids as they ran out of the house and things like that. So, any study on ethnic curses, things like that?
Not that I've done, but you're right that there are that is a category that I neglected to mention. In a variety of cultures, there's a belief that you can invoke negative outcome using language, and this provides some of the eventual profane vocabulary. I think that there's a step from a curse, which is actually based on a belief that you can incur that negative outcome in someone. That is actually a religious expression of some kind or a spiritual expression of some kind. Mm-hmm. For it to migrate then to be something that's just disparaging them or deprecating them. And by the time it gets there, it's oftentimes lost a lot of its punch. Now, the case of Yiddish is a good example of a place where that was not the case. Italian has some of this as well. Chinese has some of it as well. There are lots of examples. Yeah, it's definitely it's a little bit different because they tend to be, as you said, expressions rather than single words. So it's like this is an utterance. This is a thing that I do. It's a demonstrative, it's a performative act. It's a thing that I do to express a whole belief. It's not something that I fit into the grammar and lexicon of my language. So they're kind of a special sort of thing. We don't have much of that in English anymore.
But especially when they add, and for generations to come, those are the best. I love curses.
They're very evocative.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Jim Peterson has the last question.
Yes, I was interested in a particular word that was said to be in one context the most discomforting word in the English language, and that word was moist. Why would that be the case?
Great. So that's an example of something called a word aversion. There are people who report having strong aversions to particular words. Moist is the most reported one for English. About 10% of people report having an aversion to that particular word. So there's actually been some research on it. Exactly what makes that word uncomfortable to people. There are two causes, and they seem to have to both be present in order for it to work. The first is something about the sound of the word, and the second is something about the potential meanings of the word. And so people find that word aversive more so in the context where there could be some sexual innuendo than when it could be something that's talking about like a chocolate cake or something like that, which makes us think that there is actually some sort of something about the meaning is important there too. But yeah, people have, the other examples that people report in the literature, so moist, crevice, what are others? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Yeah, there's a whole list of such words that some people will find will have an aversion to. Probably it's a consequence of some of some early childhood learning. Like you don't gain this late in life. Usually, it's something that happened early on that was aversive or that had some aversive component that transferred onto the word that was used in that context. But yeah, we don't fully understand it. There are only a couple of papers on it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bergen, and everybody for coming. And we had quite a stimulating conversation. So appreciate it very much.
It's my pleasure. Well, thank you so much, and for all these fantastic questions. I really did enjoy it.
Good.
Thank you. I'm enjoying your book. I'm on chapter 5.
Thank you very much.
I can recommend it as well. You can buy it on eBay for about $7 used, by the way. Hardcover.
Oh, but give him a break. You got to buy it new so he can get some.
Oh, I don't make any money off of it at this point anyway. It's it's 5 years ago. No, get it however you want. I mean, I give it away to my undergrads when I can, but yeah, you can. Libraries, as I see, Joe, you got it from the library. Libraries also carry it. Yeah. Some of them do still. While we still have libraries, take advantage.
Yeah, he was telling me that St. Pete, was it, Joe?
I beg your pardon?
You were
St.
saying
Pete, yeah. The Pinellas County libraries have 4 copies of it. Yeah. Is it available as a PDF online?
I'm using the audio book from the library. Who's narrating that?
Well, I auditioned and was given the role of myself in that book. So yeah, I'm doing the narration.
Great book.
Thank you. Yeah, there's also there's an ebook version of it as well. There's all the things.
There's no room for failure in that scenario.
Really?
Well, you get to correct your failures. That's the thing. So I didn't want to let someone else read it because all of the mistakes that I made would then automatically be translated into the audiobook version. I wanted to be able to fix them as I went.
Do you have a new book coming out anytime soon?
Not quite yet. You may have heard there's this pandemic on, and so I've got 2 young children, and they're not at school, and so there's very little time for things like book writing. But there may be something coming.
Available virtually. Can we watch? Can we log on to your class by Zoom and audit the course?
You're talking about first grade with my 6-year-old, or?
No, more of the University of California.
That's a good question. There's some auditing system through UC San Diego Extension, but I think that you have to pay for it. I'm not entirely sure. I don't get any auditors for whatever reason. Maybe we don't advertise it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and we've really enjoyed it, and hope to have you back sometime soon. Maybe when you have a new book or something else you'd like to talk about.
That'd be fun.
To come back.
Yep,
See everybody next week.